The galaxy turned its back on them. But humanity refused to walk away. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, crackling through the quantum communicators of every human colony, station, and ship scattered across the Outer Rim territories. Ambassador Elena Vasquez read it 3 times before the full weight of the words sank in. Effective immediately, the Galactic Council hereby revokes all trade agreements, diplomatic relations, and territorial recognitions with the species known as humanity. All human presence is to be withdrawn from Council space within 1 standard cycle. Violation of this decree will result in immediate military action. Elena's hands trembled as she set down the crystalline datapad. Around her, the bustling diplomatic center of New Geneva Station had fallen silent. Every human face wore the same expression of stunned disbelief. "Ma'am," her aide, Marcus Chen, approached cautiously. "The other species ambassadors are requesting immediate meetings. The Zephyrians seem apologetic. The Korthak delegation won't even look in our direction." Elena nodded slowly, her mind racing. 300 years of careful diplomacy, of proving humanity belonged among the stars, wiped away with a single decree. "Tell them we'll meet with anyone willing to explain this madness." The explanation, when it came, was worse than she'd imagined. The hegemony had spoken. The ancient race that had guided galactic civilization for millennia had declared humanity too dangerous to exist alongside other species. Their reasoning was as cold as the void between stars. Humans were too unpredictable, too willing to fight when others would surrender, too stubborn to accept the natural order of things. "You don't understand your place," explained Ambassador Veltar of the Zephyrians, his 4 arms gesturing apologetically. "When the Korthak demanded tribute from your colonies, you fought back. When the Zerian collective tried to claim your mining rights, you refused to negotiate. When pirates attacked your merchant vessels, you hunted them down instead of accepting the losses like civilized species do." Elena felt her jaw clench. "So we're being punished for defending ourselves?" "You're being removed because you upset the balance," Veltar's translator buzzed. "The hegemony maintains order through established hierarchies. Strong species protect weak ones in exchange for resources and loyalty. But humans refuse to be weak. You won't submit, you won't pay tribute, and you certainly won't let others dictate your fate. That makes you chaos incarnate." The meeting with the other ambassadors followed similar patterns. Even species that had considered humanity friends now spoke with regret about the unfortunate necessity of severing all ties. The hegemony's word was absolute: cross them and face extinction. Elena returned to her quarters that night with the weight of an entire species on her shoulders. Outside her viewport, the great wheel of New Geneva Station continued its eternal rotation, but everything felt different now. The diverse mix of species that had made the station a symbol of galactic cooperation were already beginning to segregate. Non-human species clustered together in hushed conversations, while human personnel moved with the hollow expressions of the condemned. Her communicator chimed with an encrypted message from Earth. President Sarah Mitchell's face appeared in the holographic display, her usually composed features tight with stress. "Elena, I need a straight answer. Can this decision be reversed?" "No, Madam President. I've spoken to every contact we have. The hegemony doesn't negotiate, and they don't explain their decisions beyond what we've already heard. We have 1 standard cycle to withdraw from all Council space, or they'll use force. And if we comply," Elena took a deep breath, "then humanity becomes a pariah species. No trade, no shared technology, no communication with the rest of galactic civilization. We'll be completely isolated, like we were before first contact. Worse, now we know what we're missing." President Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. "The Joint Chiefs are already drawing up evacuation plans. 3 billion people scattered across 200 worlds, stations, and ships. Getting everyone back to human space will take months, even with every transport vessel we can commandeer. There's something else, Elena said carefully. The outer rim colonies won't make it. The distances are too great, and some of them have populations that can't survive relocation. Children born in low gravity, atmospheric processors that can't be shut down without killing everyone who depends on them, people with medical conditions that require specific environmental factors. The president's face grew pale. How many? Conservative estimate, 50 million people who physically cannot be evacuated in time. The silence stretched between them across the light years. Finally, President Mitchell spoke, her voice carrying a steely determination Elena recognized from history books. Then we don't evacuate everyone. Elena blinked. Ma'am? 300 years ago, humans dreamed of reaching the stars. We suffered through wars, plagues, environmental collapse, and a dozen other disasters that should have ended our species. But we're still here because humans have one trait that apparently makes us too dangerous for galactic civilization. We don't give up. The hegemony has the most powerful military in the galaxy. Their enforcement fleets could glass every human world in a matter of days. Maybe. But they've made one critical error in their calculations. President Mitchell's eyes hardened. They assume we'll behave like every other species they've cowed into submission. They expect us to either comply meekly or make a token gesture of defiance before accepting defeat. And we won't? Elena, humans once fought a war that lasted 6 years and killed 50 million people because one madman decided some races were inferior to others. We've toppled empires, overthrown tyrants, and rebuilt civilization from ashes more times than our historians can count. We've never, in our entire history, accepted that someone else had the right to determine our fate. Elena felt something stirring in her chest, a warmth she recognized as hope. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that the galaxy is about to learn why apex predators don't make good pets. President Mitchell leaned forward. Begin implementing Protocol Lazarus. Anyone who wants to evacuate gets full support. Anyone who wants to stay and fight gets everything else. The colonies that can't be evacuated will become the foundation of a new kind of human civilization, one that doesn't ask permission to exist. Elena nodded slowly. Protocol Lazarus had been a theoretical contingency plan, filed away in the deepest archives of human military doctrine. She'd read about it during her diplomatic training, never imagining it would actually be implemented. The protocol was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. If humanity ever faced existential threat too great to overcome through conventional means, they would abandon conventional thinking entirely. Ma'am, you understand what this means? If we implement Lazarus, there's no going back. Every human becomes a potential combatant. Every colony becomes a fortress. Every ship becomes a weapon. We'll be fighting a war against the entire galaxy. No, Elena. We'll be fighting a war for the right to exist in this galaxy. There's a difference. The transmission ended, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts. Outside her viewport, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the species that dreamed beneath their light. But something had changed in those few minutes of conversation. The weight on her shoulders felt different now, less like a burden and more like responsibility. She activated her personal communicator and began sending messages to every human on the station. The first phase of Protocol Lazarus was information dissemination. Every human needed to understand their options, and every human needed to make their own choice about what came next. The message was simple. The galaxy has decided we don't belong. The question is whether we accept their judgment or make them regret it. By morning, the answers were flooding back through human communication networks across the galaxy. The pattern was consistent regardless of location, age, or occupation. Roughly 30% requested immediate evacuation to core human worlds. Another 20% wanted to relocate, but stay within human space to support the war effort. The remaining 50% had a different response entirely. They were staying put, not because they couldn't leave, but because they refused to be driven from homes they'd built with their own hands under foreign stars. Elena read the reports with growing amazement. Miners on asteroid stations choosing to fortify their positions rather than abandon decades of work. Scientists on research outposts volunteering to turn their laboratories into weapons development facilities. Families on agricultural worlds organizing militias while their children played in alien gardens they'd helped plant. The galaxy had made a fundamental miscalculation. They'd assumed humans would react like every other species they dominated, with resignation, compliance, and eventual submission to superior force. Instead, they'd awakened something that had slumbered in the human psyche since the species first looked up at the stars and wondered what it would take to reach them. Helena began drafting her reply to the Galactic Council's ultimatum. It would be delivered in exactly the way humans preferred to communicate when their backs were against the wall, clearly, directly, and with absolutely no room for misinterpretation. The galaxy may have turned its back on humanity, but we have never learned how to walk away from a fight. You wanted us gone in one cycle. We'll give you our answer in half that time. As she sealed the message for transmission, Elena allowed herself a grim smile. The hegemony had ruled the galaxy for millennia by convincing species that resistance was futile. They were about to discover that futility was a concept humanity had never quite managed to grasp. The galaxy turned its back on them. But humanity refused to walk away. Captain Maria Santos had been mining asteroids for 15 years when the galaxy decided her life wasn't worth living. The irony wasn't lost on her as she watched the last evacuation transport disappear into hyperspace, leaving her and 43 other miners alone in the Kepler 442 system. "Think they'll actually come?" asked Jake Morrison, her second-in-command, as he sealed the blast door to the station's main bay. "Oh, they'll come," Maria replied, checking the charge on her plasma rifle. "The hegemony doesn't make empty threats. Question is whether we'll be ready when they do." The mining station, Prometheus, had been humanity's first foothold in the system, built into a nickel-iron asteroid rich enough to fund a dozen colonies. Now it was something else entirely, the first human fortress designed specifically to make the galaxy regret its ultimatum. 3 weeks had passed since Ambassador Vasquez delivered humanity's response to the Galactic Council. The message had been broadcast on every frequency, translated into every major galactic language, and sent to every corner of Council space. It was only 7 words long, but those 7 words had changed everything. Come and take them if you can. The reaction had been swift and predictable. Outrage from the hegemony, nervous muttering from client species, and complete communication blackout from all official channels. But something else had happened too, something that made Maria think humanity might actually have a chance. Ships had started disappearing. Not human ships, but the patrol vessels and cargo haulers that formed the backbone of galactic commerce. They'd vanish between systems, sometimes leaving behind scattered debris, sometimes simply never arriving at their destinations. The attacks were too coordinated to be random piracy, too widespread to be local unrest. "Prometheus Base, this is Ghost Runner, requesting permission to dock." Maria activated the communication panel with a grin. Ghost Runner was the code name for Captain Elena Vasquez, who had somehow transformed herself from a diplomat into something far more dangerous in the space of 3 weeks. "Permission granted, Ghost Runner. Base 7 is clear." The ship that docked wasn't the sleek diplomatic vessel Elena had once used to travel between embassies. This was something cobbled together from salvaged parts and human ingenuity. A stealth corvette that could slip past sensors like smoke through a hurricane. When Elena disembarked, she wore the black uniform of the newly formed Human Resistance Navy, a rank insignia that didn't exist in any military manual pinned to her collar. "Admiral," Maria said with a mock salute. "Fancy seeing you in our little corner of nowhere." Elena smiled tiredly. "It's Commodore now, and I'm here because this is exactly the kind of nowhere the galaxy is about to notice." She brought disturbing news from the core systems. The hegemony had mobilized 3 full battle fleets, enough firepower to sterilize a dozen worlds. Their target wasn't the heavily defended colonies near Sol, but the scattered outposts like Prometheus, remote stations and settlements that couldn't be easily reinforced. "They're planning to make examples," Elena explained as they reviewed tactical displays in the station's command center. "Hit the isolated communities first, broadcast the footage throughout council space. Show everyone what happens to species that refuse to submit." "And we're supposed to just sit here and let them?" Jake asked. "No." Elena's expression hardened. "We're supposed to make them pay so dearly for every human life that the rest of the galaxy starts asking whether the hegemony's protection is worth the price." She outlined the plan with the calm precision of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The scattered human outposts weren't going to fight conventional defensive battles. Instead, they would become traps, designed to lure hegemony forces into engagements that favored human tactics over superior technology. "Humans learn to fight dirty before we learn to walk upright," Elena continued. "Every military doctrine in our history is based on the assumption that we'll be outgunned, outnumbered, and fighting for our lives. The hegemony has spent millennia crushing opponents who tried to meet them on equal terms." Maria studied the tactical projections. "So we don't fight fair. We don't fight their way at all. Ambush tactics, guerrilla warfare, asymmetric response to everything they throw at us. Make every victory cost them more than they're willing to pay." The transformation of Prometheus Station took 2 weeks. The mining equipment was retrofitted into weapon systems. The asteroid's natural caves expanded into a labyrinth of defensive positions, and every piece of human technology jury-rigged into something the galaxy had never seen before. The other miners threw themselves into the work with the focused intensity of people who knew their lives depended on getting every detail right. They welded armor plating from mining mechs onto the station's external structures, programmed the excavation drones to carry improvised explosives, and turned the massive ore refineries into fabrication centers for ammunition. But the real weapons weren't mechanical. They were human. Maria watched her people prepare for war and felt a fierce pride in their adaptability. These were miners, engineers, and technicians who had never fired a shot in anger. 3 weeks ago, they'd been worried about ore quotas and equipment maintenance schedules. Now they were calculating kill zones and defensive firing lanes with the same methodical precision they'd once applied to extracting platinum from asteroid rock. The enemy arrived on a Thursday. The hegemony battle group dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. 12 ships ranging from patrol corvettes to a massive dreadnought bristling with enough firepower to crack a moon. They moved with the confident precision of predators who had never encountered real resistance. "All stations, this is Prometheus Base," Maria transmitted on the general frequency. "Target priority is the command vessel. Remember, we only get one chance to make them think twice." The battle began exactly as Elena had predicted. The hegemony forces approached the asteroid field with overwhelming confidence, expecting token resistance from a mining station. Their scans detected the human fortifications, but classified them as negligible threats compared to their superior firepower. They were still maintaining that confidence when the asteroid field exploded. The first wave of attacks came from the rocks themselves. Prometheus hadn't been the only human installation in the system. Every significant asteroid had been hollowed out, weaponized, and turned into a remote-controlled fortress. The hegemony ships found themselves surrounded by enemies they hadn't even known existed. The humans had spent 3 weeks turning a mining operation into a 3-dimensional killing field. Plasma cannons erupted from concealed positions, missile swarms launched from hidden bays, and the asteroids themselves began moving with purpose as concealed engines drove them into collision courses with enemy vessels. But the real surprise was how the humans fought. Galactic military doctrine was based on formations, hierarchy, and overwhelming application of superior force. Human tactics were based on chaos, improvisation, and making the enemy's advantages into liabilities. When a hegemony cruiser moved to destroy what appeared to be a weapons platform, the platform exploded in a carefully controlled detonation that sent asteroid fragments spinning into the ship's drive systems. When fighters swarmed the human positions, they found themselves flying through clouds of metallic chaff that turned their own targeting systems against them. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, the hegemony battle group was gone. Not destroyed, but withdrawn after losing 4 ships and suffering damage to the rest. They had technically achieved their objective. Prometheus Station was a burning wreck, its defenders dead or scattered. But the footage of the battle spread across galactic communication networks like wildfire. For the first time in 1,000 years, someone had made the hegemony bleed. Maria Santos died in the final assault, buried under tons of rubble when the station's central hub collapsed. But her last transmission reached every human outpost in the galaxy. Prometheus has fallen, but the price was 12-1. Make them pay more. Elena received the message aboard her stealth corvette as she fled toward the next fortress system. Around her, the refugee ships carried the survivors who had chosen evacuation over defiance. But they weren't running away anymore. They were moving to positions where they could continue the fight. The galaxy had expected humanity to either submit or die quietly. Instead, they had created something new. A species-wide guerrilla war that turned every human settlement into a potential battlefield. The hegemony could destroy individual outposts, but each victory came at a cost that made the next battle more difficult. Elena studied the tactical reports flooding in from across human space. The pattern was consistent. Humans didn't fight to win battles. They fought to make winning too expensive to sustain. Mining stations became fortress traps, research facilities turned into weapons laboratories, and agricultural colonies organized resistance cells that made occupation impossible. But the most important change was happening in the spaces between battles. Other species were watching the conflict with growing unease. For 1,000 years, the hegemony had maintained order through the threat of overwhelming force. If that threat proved hollow against even one determined species, what did that mean for the rest of galactic civilization? Elena began crafting her next message to the galaxy. This one would be longer than 7 words, but its meaning would be just as clear. Humanity wasn't just refusing to die quietly. They were showing every other oppressed species in the galaxy that resistance was possible. The real war was just beginning. The galaxy turned its back on them, but humanity refused to walk away. 6 months after the Battle of Prometheus, Commodore Elena Vasquez stood in the command center of humanity's most improbable achievement, a mobile fortress built inside a converted asteroid that humanity had somehow managed to propel across 3 star systems without anyone in the galaxy noticing. "The Zephyrians are requesting another meeting," reported Lieutenant Commander Chen, his young face bearing scars from the siege of Titan Station. "That makes 15 species this week." Elena smiled grimly as she studied the tactical display showing the current positions of human resistance cells across the outer rim. "What are they offering this time?" "Safe passage to neutral space if we stop attacking their shipping lanes, plus compensation for misunderstandings regarding our territorial rights." The irony was delicious. 6 months ago, the Zephyrians had apologetically explained why they couldn't oppose the hegemony's decision to exile humanity. Now they were begging for mercy from the species they had helped condemn. "Tell them the same thing we told the Korthak yesterday and the Zerion Collective last week," Elena instructed. Humanity doesn't negotiate with species that refuse to acknowledge our right to exist. They want safe shipping. They know what they need to do. Chen nodded and moved to compose the reply. Elena turned back to the reports that painted an extraordinary picture of human adaptation. What had started as a desperate guerrilla war had evolved into something the galaxy had never seen, a species-wide insurgency that operated according to principles that made conventional military response impossible. The humans weren't trying to hold territory or win decisive battles. Instead, they had become a force of nature that struck wherever the galaxy felt most vulnerable. Merchant convoys disappeared between systems. Industrial facilities suffered mysterious accidents. Communication networks experienced inexplicable failures that somehow always benefited human operations. But the real genius of the human resistance wasn't in their tactics. It was in their strategy. Every human attack was filmed, documented, and broadcast across galactic networks. But these weren't the propaganda videos that species typically use to intimidate enemies. They were something far more dangerous: tutorials. Elena pulled up the latest transmission from the Sol system, where President Mitchell had transformed Earth's entire industrial capacity into a resistance coordination center. The message was ostensibly addressed to scattered human forces, but everyone in the galaxy knew it was really meant for the oppressed client species of the hegemony. Today we're going to discuss asymmetric naval tactics, President Mitchell began, standing in what appeared to be a repurposed factory floor. Behind her, workers assembled the components of improvised weapons while she spoke. The key principle is that superior technology becomes a liability when your enemy refuses to engage on your terms. The video continued with detailed explanations of how human forces had learned to turn hegemony advantages against them. Heavy armor that protected ships from conventional weapons became death traps when humans introduced weaponized nanomachines that ate through hulls from the inside. Advanced sensors that could detect any known technology became useless when humans started building weapons from materials that registered as space debris. But the most effective human innovation wasn't technological at all. It was psychological. The galaxy operates on a hierarchy of fear, President Mitchell explained. The strong dominate the weak because the weak believe resistance is impossible. Humans are proving that belief wrong, one battle at a time. Elena knew the impact these broadcasts were having because she could see it in the intelligence reports flooding in from across the galaxy. Client species that had never questioned hegemony authority were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Why were humans, supposedly primitive and militarily inferior, able to strike at will throughout council space? Why were the mighty hegemony fleets unable to stop attacks by scattered resistance cells? Most importantly, why were the hegemony's client species bearing the cost of a war their masters had started? The answer was becoming obvious to anyone paying attention. The hegemony's power had always been built on the assumption that resistance was futile. Humans had shattered that assumption, and the cracks were spreading throughout galactic civilization. "Ma'am," Chen interrupted her thoughts, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Earth. It's President Mitchell." Elena authorized the encrypted channel, and the president's holographic image appeared in the center of the command deck. Even across the light years, Elena could see the exhaustion in her leader's eyes, but also something else: vindicated determination. "Elena, I need you to see this before we make it public." President Mitchell transmitted a data packet that contained the latest intelligence from their assets within council space. The Hegemony Council met yesterday. For the first time in recorded history, their client species demanded representation in the discussions. Elena felt her pulse quicken as she reviewed the report. The meeting had been chaos. Species that had never dared question hegemony. Decisions were now demanding explanations for the continued war against humanity. The economic cost of constant military operations was straining resources across the galaxy, while human attacks made normal commerce increasingly dangerous. "It gets better," President Mitchell continued. The Velnari Confederation formally withdrew from the Council 3 days ago. They're declaring neutrality and offering to mediate peace talks. Elena stared at the data in amazement. The Velnari were one of the most ancient members of the galactic community, species whose loyalty to the hegemony had been absolute for over 2,000 years. Their defection would send shockwaves through every corner of Council space. "What are our terms?" Elena asked. "Complete restoration of all rights and territories, formal recognition of human sovereignty, and reparations for the destruction of our colonies." President Mitchell's expression hardened. "Also, structural reforms to the Council that prevent this from happening to any other species. And if the hegemony refuses, then we continue demonstrating that their authority only extends as far as their ability to enforce it, which, as it turns out, isn't nearly as far as they thought." The transmission ended, leaving Elena alone with the implications. Humanity had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had forced the masters of civilization to negotiate from a position of weakness. But more importantly, they had proved to every oppressed species in the galaxy that the hegemony could be defied successfully. The response came 2 weeks later, in the form of a carefully worded invitation to peace negotiations on the neutral world of Kepler Prime. The language was diplomatic, but Elena could read between the lines. The hegemony wasn't offering to negotiate because they wanted peace. They were negotiating because they no longer had any choice. Elena stood on the observation deck of the mobile fortress as it emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system. Around them, the greatest gathering of starships in galactic history waited in carefully arranged formations. Hegemony battle fleets maintained their distance from human vessels, while representatives from dozens of species watched the proceedings with barely concealed fascination. But Elena's attention was focused on the ships that shouldn't have been there, vessels flying the colors of species that had supposedly remained loyal to the hegemony: the Aldani Republic, the Thaxon Collective, the Meridian Alliance. All of them sending representatives to negotiations they weren't officially part of. "They're all here to see what happens when someone says no to the hegemony and means it," Chen observed, joining her at the viewport. Elena nodded. "And to decide whether they want to keep being afraid of masters who couldn't even handle one upstart species." The negotiations lasted 3 days. Elena participated via secure transmission from her ship, refusing the hegemony's demand that she attend in person. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a surrender ceremony, and she wasn't going to risk the leadership of the human resistance in case the talks were a trap. But as the discussions progressed, it became clear that the hegemony was in no position to set traps. They were fighting for their political survival against species that had suddenly remembered they outnumbered their masters 1,000 to 1. The final agreement was everything President Mitchell had demanded and more. Humanity would be restored to full membership in the galactic community with expanded territorial rights and guaranteed autonomy. The council structure would be reformed to prevent any single species from wielding absolute authority, and most importantly, any species that chose to withdraw from the hegemony's protection would be guaranteed the same rights to self-determination that humans had fought to establish. Elena read the terms with satisfaction, but also with the knowledge that the real victory wasn't written in any treaty. The real victory was in the dozens of species already filing applications to withdraw from hegemony authority, choosing uncertain independence over guaranteed subjugation. "Think they'll honor the agreement?" Chen asked as they watched the signing ceremony on the main display. "For now," Elena replied. "But that's not really the point anymore. The point is that every species in the galaxy now knows the hegemony isn't invincible. That knowledge can't be taken back, and it can't be suppressed." A year later, Elena stood in the observation lounge of the rebuilt New Geneva station, watching the bustle of genuine galactic commerce resume around humanity's diplomatic hub. But the galaxy had changed in ways that went far beyond the simple restoration of human rights. The hegemony still existed, but their empire had shrunk to a fraction of its former size as species after species chose independence. In their place, a loose confederation of free worlds had emerged, bound together by mutual defense pacts and the shared understanding that strength came from cooperation, not domination. Humanity had become the unofficial leaders of this new alliance, not because they had conquered anyone, but because they had proved that freedom was worth fighting for. Young beings from a dozen different species attended human military academies to learn the tactics that had brought down the oldest empire in galactic history. Scientists from across the galaxy collaborated on research projects that would have been impossible under hegemony restrictions. Elena received a message that made her smile: the first human babies born on worlds that had once been forbidden to them. Children who would grow up in a galaxy where no one could tell them they didn't belong. The galaxy had turned its back on humanity, but humanity had refused to walk away. In the end, that stubbornness had saved more than just the human species. It had saved the very idea that sapient beings could determine their own destiny among the stars. Outside the viewport, ships from 100 worlds moved through space with the confidence of species that had remembered how to stand upright. The universe was vast and full of wonders, and for the first time in millennia, every sapient being in it was free to explore those wonders on their own terms. Humanity had taught the galaxy an old lesson that had been almost forgotten. Sometimes the most important victory isn't winning a war, but proving that some things are worth fighting for no matter the odds.